Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope you're well this evening. This evening, I'd like to explore the topic of emptiness, but not in the traditional way that the term is used. The traditional teaching of the term emptiness, the way you most often hear it, is referring to the quality of all experience. And sometimes people hear the term emptiness and they think it's nothingness, but that's not the meaning at all. It's simply referring to that all experiences they're impermanent, they're constantly changing, and that there's no permanent essence to any of them. And the example that's often given is very accessible, is just to consider a thought. We all have thoughts, we're experiencing them all the time. And it's real, it's a real experience happening, but there's not much to a thought, right? It's kind of wispy and ephemeral, and it comes from where was it before it arose? Where did it go afterwards? It had an existence in the moment, but there was no essence to the thought that carried through. That's kind of the idea. It's actually a big topic to explore, but the reason for even speaking in this way is not so much to make, what would you say, ontological truth statements about the nature of reality, although people do hold it that way. It's more as an aid to help us let go of clinging to things, identifying and holding on because of, as just I said, that empty nature of things, that you can try, but you really can't hold on to things. And another image that's sometimes used is if you try to hold water in your cupped hands, you can hold water, but no matter how much you press your fingers and hands together, no matter how tightly, a little water will leak through and drip, and eventually it's lost. You really can't hold it in your hands for too long. And the harder we try, it's actually painful. It creates suffering as you press harder and try to do that. So that's another image that's then encouraging us into the freedom of letting go. So that's very brief and doesn't really do full justice to the traditional teaching on emptiness. But I just wanted to touch on that because I'm bringing in the term and I'm going to use it in a different sense. So I just wanted to put that out, since that's the way that if any of us for those of us who've been around the Buddhist world or the Dharma scene for any length of time, and you hear talks on emptiness, it's kind of along the lines I was just speaking. There's a beautiful image I like that gets more towards the aspect of emptiness that I want to spend a little time with this evening. And imagine yourself a person in a boat floating maybe on a lake or in a river, and you're going along, and then another boat comes along and rams into your boat. And then perhaps we get angry and, what's that person doing? And aren't they looking? Or are they trying to ram me? And we get all irritated until we notice that there's no one in the other boat. It's empty. And then the anger disappears because there was no one there to be, in whatever our story is, to be unaware or trying to hit us or whatever. And so it goes on then to advise us to make our own boat empty. And then no one will oppose us, no one will have conflict with us as we go through the world. So I like that story, and has a beautiful feel to it. And it points to this other kind of emptying out. It's not the empty nature of experience. The conventional everyday sense in which we use the term empty means that there's nothing there, right? We've become emptied out. And So as for those of you who are experienced meditation practitioners, you know that if we were to go around and check in with everyone here, there would be a wide range of ways in which the fruits of meditation reveal themselves and unfold and progress, how they develop. And it can take a lot of forms. There can be the sense of calming and a sense of equanimity and non-reactivity can carry through. Senses of more people feel it as they become just more aware of more details of what's going on in their experience. So they have more finely attuned mindfulness. There's many, many forms, things that can happen through the meditation. One of the things that can happen, and none of this is what's supposed to happen. The only thing that's supposed to happen is what actually is happening. I know that's kind of a cliche, but I mean, really. And actually, let me pause on that for a moment. I'll come back to this emptying out in a moment. That's actually probably I think one of the most important teachings we can have. We often talk about, letting the present moment experience be our teacher and not doing anything that takes us away from ourselves or out of the present moment. But of course, we all will have many, many times when we forget. And it's not only true, but I think that maybe you could say one way to think of the whole Dharma is really getting it deeply in our DNA and in our bones on a cellular level. That if we can let go of what we think is supposed to happen, what should happen, and realize there is no should, there is only what's actually happening moment to moment. That's not to say we want to throw away the word should for ourselves. There's one category of things in which I feel we want to keep the word should, and that would be around what we call morality or ethics. In Pali, we use the term sila, which is sometimes called ethics or morality, is the translation. And in particular, as it manifests in what are normally called precepts, which are training rules and rules to live by. And those are things such as not causing harm, not killing is the traditional language, but not causing physical, but even mental, emotional harm. And not stealing, which is, not causing, all these different ways of not causing suffering with speech and around sexuality, misusing intoxicants that can get us into trouble. So those kind of areas, I think, is probably a good place to hold on to the should. We shouldn't kill people. We shouldn't cause physical or emotional harm. And of course, I have to add in that we do the best we can. So, we're not going to be perfect, but all we can do is the best we can. But the important thing is to hold those principles in mind the best we can, and live out of them, live from them. And then when we fall short, we learn. And actually, it goes right back to what I said a few moments ago. When we fall short, it's just what happened. And if we can hold it with that kind of wisdom, then we don't fall into beating ourselves up or being so hard on ourselves. And we can just know that we're not perfect. We might have ill will, we might have reactivity in us. We all do, we're human beings. And so we hold ourselves with more empathy and kindness, and we can learn and then recommit ourselves, re-up, if you will, and then again, the best we can without tying ourselves in a knot or getting stressed, but just reflect on our actions and then use them to move forward and inform our actions moving forward. So that's one area that, how would I say it? That I think we should hold on to the word should. But for most of life, again, it's not a should, there's just what's happening. And if we can hold it that way, then rather than creating a reactive stance in relationship to whatever's happening, we can stay open and receptive in that way. So in service of this, your Dharma practice, your meditation practice, however you want to, whatever you want to call it, whatever terms you like, well, let me back up for just a moment. What we're really talking about is the phrase that we often use is a liberation through non-clinging. So in speaking of the ways I was just speaking, for example, not getting into reaction and just not having a should, there just is what's true and real. And we can let that teach us. That's in service of freeing our hearts and minds, the liberation through non-clinging. One of the forms that the deepening of our practice can take is a feeling of being emptied out. It's not that you're supposed to, I'm going to describe what I mean in a few moments. But let me say, as I say it like that, it's not that there's any one way that your practice is supposed to unfold, right? I started to mention that there were many different ways that it can feel for people. Some people, they don't necessarily experience it as an emptying out, but they just come into a sense of non-reactivity or equanimity. Or I mentioned that people can, the preciseness of their mindfulness and awareness of what's going on within them gets very finely tuned. And because of that, they can really perceive the places when they're being reactive on subtler and subtler levels and learning to let go. So there's all these different flavors that can come. This flavor of emptying ourselves out can happen on its own for some people. And as you reflect on how I'm offering it, you can see if you actually want to incline your mind in that way, which you can do also. So you can play with it if you're drawn to this way of thinking. Let me use an example. I'll come to my example in a moment because I only gave half the picture. When it's not just emptying out, there's actually two things that are going to sound like opposites that can happen at the same time. We become emptied out and we become filled up. How can that be? That doesn't make sense, right? To be emptied out and filled up. So this really gets to the heart of what I mean of emptying ourselves out. Because on its own, if you empty out, you get filled up. Here's the example I want to give. I shared here a couple of nights ago that my son and I are amateur radios. They call them ham radio operators. And it's just something, he's kind of a science and engineering kind of a tech kid. So my background is in engineering also, electrical engineering. So it's just father-son things that we enjoy doing together. And it's kind of fun. And we just play around and we built our own equipment and all this stuff. So it's an interesting thing if you ever get on the radio. You don't even have to have a ham radio station to be able to transmit. If you're just listening, not so much in the local stations, but if you ever use shortwave radio where you can pick up stations from far away, sometimes the band that you're on, the frequency band that you're on, can be very quiet, and you can really get a good signal through. And sometimes it's very noisy. There's a lot of atmospheric noise, and you get a lot of hissing and rushing and noise, crackling, popping sounds, just from what's going on in the atmosphere. And you can't get through. You can either barely hear people, or they talk about it that the band is bad, and you can't get your signal through. In the way I'm speaking, if your radio's been filled up with a lot of noise, a lot of static. When that settles out and quiets out, that's the emptying out of the noise. And this is literally what happens. You actually can, all these subtle signals that have been coming from all around the country, maybe around the world, depending on conditions, come flooding in, and it becomes filled. Out of emptying out, it becomes quite filled up on the radio. You can connect, you can communicate, have nice conversations with people. You can hear very, very subtle and weak signals from far away, but you can discern them very clearly. Out of the emptying out of the noise, the fullness of what you want comes in. That's what I'm really getting to here within ourselves out of practice. So I'll say a little more, but as I speak, I want you to, I'm inviting you to, not want you to, I'm inviting you to reflect on what might it be like, what do we mean within ourselves if we could empty out the, what do we mean by the noise, and then be filled with something more rich, more deep, more meaningful that can come in. Well, all we have to do is pay attention to what's going on in our own minds. You just, in whatever way you can, when you think about it, just take, it could be a half a minute, a few minutes, half an hour, part of a day, a whole day, a lifetime, and just notice what's going on in your mind. If you're like most people, there's a lot of noise in there. A lot of thoughts, concerns, worries, happinesses, joys, planning. I could go on and on, right? All the stuff that's going on in our mind, and it's going on nonstop. You can't stop it, actually. Well, I should say there are very specialized states of meditation in which, while you're in those states, thoughts can't arise, and there is a stillness. It's kind of like an emptying out, but it's a temporary emptying out, because you can come out of those meditative states and then it can all come flooding back in. But so that is a real emptying. It can be a real relief and a real refuge to be, if you've developed your, if you've trained enough where that can happen, and it can just feel like a relief. There's the story, as the Buddha, he died when he was 80, when he tells Ananda was the Buddha's younger cousin, and he was also the Buddha's personal attendant for the last 25 years of the Buddha's life. And he told Ananda that I don't remember the exact quote, but basically, his body was so old, and it's sort of like we would say today, it's held together by baling wire and strapping tape. He said something like this, like it's only held together with duct tape. and he was just always had pain. And he said the only time he ever got any relief from just the physical discomfort was, and he did have a bad back, I know, comes up in the old texts. There were times where he'd say to Ananda, you go give the Dharma talk. I got to lie down, my back's killing me. By the way, what I love about that, I don't necessarily love that he was suffering, but in Buddhism, we've tended to, there's been a tendency in the religious part of it to deify the Buddha. And he went from being a person to kind of this transcendent being that can, almost fly through the air and all this miraculous stuff. And of course, I wasn't around, so I want to be respectful, and I don't really know. But the fact that he would say, oh man, my back's killing me. I can't give the talk. Ananda, you go give the talk. To me, that doesn't diminish the Buddha in any way. It's actually more inspiring, because what it means is he was just like us. And he wasn't so far away that even though he had his enlightenment and his liberation, but he wasn't disconnected from being a human being. And so when I hold it like that, it's actually inspiring. It's like, oh, sometimes my back hurts. And it's like, whatever. It's like, whatever. Somebody else has to do whatever. Go give the Dharma talk or whatever is needed. So I can relate to that, and it makes it more relatable and accessible. And in fact, these things we're talking about are not that far away. It's actually always right here, but we forget. And part of that is the noise itself. So, well, first, I just want to pause for a moment. I'm going to continue, but when I talk about emptying out the noise, sometimes people think, I've heard this many times, where people think that the purpose of meditation is to get to a place where we have no thoughts. Well, it's not for me to say what your purpose in meditation should be. You have to find for yourself. But in general, in all the traditions I've practiced in and know about, that's not the goal. I mentioned earlier, there can be specialized states you can touch into in which there aren't thoughts there. But the goal, this emptying out I'm talking about, is not dependent on not having any thoughts come up. So what am I talking about? Well, a couple of things. It can take a couple of forms. One is, I mentioned earlier that I encourage all of us to do the experiment to pay attention to your own mind. Don't make a big thing about it. Stay relaxed. But when you remember, don't stress. But when you remember, it'll pop into your, here I'm planting the seed in your mind there. So now it's going to pop in every few times each day on its own. And when it does, just check in and see, well, how's it been going? Sort of like taking the temperature or checking the weather of your mind. And you may find that a large percentage of your thoughts are some version of, am I okay? Am I going to be okay? I'm not okay. I'm not going to be okay. How am I going to be okay? Judging or comparing us with others or a situation. And I like this and I don't like this. And how am I going to get this? I'm going to keep this. I'm worried I'm going to lose that. And I'm not saying that some of those aren't genuine concerns that we need to pay attention to. That's part of the wise discernment, is knowing when we're given, when we need to listen, something to listen to, of course. And a lot of the noise, which is just the mind cranking around and it just won't stop, right? So if you do the experiment and you notice that, by the way, if you do the experiment, I don't want to be arrogant here, but you'll find some version of this, because we're human beings. This is how minds work. The details are different. I hope you also have happiness and joy in the mix there too. It's all of this stuff is coming and going. It takes many forms, just like on the ham radio. It's not all a hiss. Sometimes you get a crackle or a pop or a hum. Many, many different forms in the noise. So it's all coming in. It's not even inherently noise if it's known and seen clearly. The real trick is not that we have to have no thoughts. It's that not to be bothered by our thoughts. Another way is not to be, I love this word I use often. If you hang around with me, you're going to hear it many times, entangled with our thoughts. There's this, it's one of my favorite ways of thinking, because it's different than having to be dispassionate, which is a great word, unless we take it the wrong way and think it means to be disconnected or remote or removed from all this messiness in our bodies and our minds. Disentangled allows us to be intimate and to have a deep, palpable, a somatic in our bodies, a intimacy with our hearts and minds, a real intimacy and connection with ourselves, but in a way that's not all caught in it and at the effect of it all. So one kind of emptying out is we can actually hit a place in what I'm going to describe. It's hard to describe. If you experience it, you'll know it. So let me just say this. And if it doesn't make sense, you can just tuck it away in your memory banks. And when it happens, you'll know. A lot can be going on in the mind. And underneath it, there can be a place of steadiness that is not, that's kind of emptied out, that allows, it's a spacious mind. Jack Kornfield, if you know him, and he's done, well known for doing these, what are called big sky meditations. And the idea is, it's a guided thing he does, but you want to get in this place where we're not so narrowly constricted, but our experience of our own awareness and consciousness in our minds, it becomes open and spacious and like the big sky. And so it's big enough to hold all the clouds that come through, including storm clouds. They come through. It can be intense. They can roll out, emotions, moods can come through, can be quite intense. And then the sunshine is there, the blue sky, white puffy clouds can all come. Same thing in our minds. That's a kind of emptying out right there, because there's an awareness and a steadiness and a knowing that's disentangled and that allows for whatever wants to come has to come. And because we don't get into the reactive stance and then create another level of suffering because of our reaction, and we really know how to let ourselves be. I know that isn't hard when what's actually happening hurts, okay? I really want to be respectful of those times. That's not easy, right? You don't need me to say it, but I want to say it because it's important to validate those times in us. It may all be empty, but many years ago when I was quite young, I was at Tassajara. For those of you who live here in California on the West Coast, it's a Soto Zen Center in the mountains down near Monterey. And I guess maybe part of the Ventura Wilderness part. I'm not sure exactly what they call those mountains where it is. And it's a rural rustic center where there's monastics who live there, and then guests come, and it's sort of known. You can go stay at Tassajara, hang out with all the Zen things, but they've got hot springs, and they feed you pretty good food, and you can hike, and that's how they make their income. I was walking along behind these two older Zen monks, and they had the real thing. They were in black and the robes, and they were these older guys, and I had my image of what a Zen monk is. And as I'm walking behind them, one of them said to the other, I'd much rather contemplate the emptiness of bliss than the emptiness of suffering. And first of all, it's just like, oh, these guys I didn't know Zen guys were like that, but he's a human being. It was so liberating. I love it. And every time I think about that, I can go, yeah, you're not getting any argument from me. However, when my suffering is there, if I have the awareness to know what's happening, if I don't, there's nothing you can do. You're caught up in it. But if I know what's happening, then again, it's just what's happening in the moment. Then I'm faced with, what am I going to do? What's needed? What's necessary? What's wise and skillful? Do nothing, involve myself with it in some way, whatever's needed. So that's one kind of emptying out. Another kind of emptying out is even the storm clouds smooth out more and more, and we have more of the ups and downs aren't so extreme in us. And I remember once many years ago, my meditation was starting to open up, and I was starting to get into some of these states that I kept hearing about of concentration, and I was getting all excited about it, and because, oh wow, good things are happening, and I went to the teacher and told him what was happening, and he just said, well, I wouldn't get too excited about it. Both the pleasant and the unpleasant are just going to keep getting stronger. I think that it can be like that sometimes, right? But also, what he didn't add in is that the highs and lows can tend to smooth out. That's another thing that can happen for many of us. It's another form this emptying out takes. And just on its own, because it just comes out of our practice. And so it doesn't mean we still won't have things going on in the minds, but things can just smooth out. Well, what can happen? It's sort of going back to the image of the ham radio, or I'll shift the image now to go to the famous Ajahn Chah quote that we always use. It's such a good quote about the still forest pool, because it just hits it exactly right on. And I can get the quote pretty close. I don't have it exact, but he says to make your mind like a still forest pool. This is the, I'll come back with a quote in a moment. That's the undistracted, mindful, awake presence. It's similar to having a big sky mind, but it's similar, although the feeling doesn't have to be spacious, it can be a narrow feel in the mind. Non-reactivity, equanimity, steadiness, clarity, all these different terms we can use, emptying ourselves out. Make your mind like a still forest pool. All kinds of rare and wonderful, you will see many things come and go. All kinds of, so he's saying, make yourself still, but things are still coming and going. All kinds of rare and wonderful animals will come to drink at the pool, but you will be still. And he goes on to say, well, anyway, I forgot the rest, but I don't have my quote book next to me. This is a kind of what I mean when I'm pointing to with this emptying out. The still forest pool is a great image because it can be like that, where it doesn't mean you have to shut down the flow of experience, but we can, so things come and go, experiences come and go, all these rare and wonderful animals, but underneath that we can be still. So the last piece I want to bring in is about the filling up. I've been saying a little bit about emptying ourselves out. What do I mean by then you become filled? Because if we empty out the noise, what do we mean? Well, what I mean is, I'm just pausing here because this is well, I'm just going to go for it here. It's getting into an area that's a little tricky depending on the school of Buddhism and the way they speak of things. In Theravada Buddhism, I'll come back to this, to my point in a moment. In Theravada Buddhism, we tend not to talk in terms of, it's more focused on the emptying out, or one way it's talked about in the old Christian Latin traditions, there's what they call the via negativa and the via positiva, the way of negation and the way of affirmation. And so if you were using in the Christian world, I'm going to be careful, or I'm not a Christian, so I'm probably misrepresented, but the point that I'm making works. If you're thinking about God, you can say everything is the via positiva. God is, fill it in, all knowing, all powerful, all loving, and whatever the positive attributes. Via negativa is sort of take away, it's not this, not this, not this, what it's not. So the Theravada Buddhism tends to be the via negativa. Don't cling to this, don't cling to that as self. And so it's letting go of what you're not. And I think what the idea is it strips away layers that we cling to. Then it doesn't spend a lot of time talking about, well, then what's there? So we have to be careful. Other Buddhist traditions talk about sort of some deeper, more fundamental reality in more via positiva terms. I'm going to step out of Buddhist tradition completely here. So just be aware of that. This is just me speaking. I'm not representing any tradition. And if you don't like the way I formulate it, just forget it. What fills in? When the noise settles out, I will just say something quite profound, and I would say beautiful, that's more of an essence of our being. Here you can see I'm getting away from the Buddhist way of is revealed. The image that we use over and over, that when the sun is blazing, the entire Milky Way, if you haven't done this and you ever have a chance to go to the Big Island in Hawaii, there's the two big volcanoes on it. One is Mauna Kea, and it's got the Keck Observatory up at the top at 12,000 feet. But you can go take the road up to the visitor center on Mauna Kea at 9,000 feet. And you're at 9,000 feet. Bring a warm coat, by the way, if you do that. It's cold. At 9,000 feet, it's considered some of the clearest air on Earth on that island. Actually, scientists, if they want to sample like super pure air, they go to the Big Island. There's certain spots there, so it's going to be as clear as air gets. And I have never seen such the thickness of the heavens and the firmament and the stars as that. And the Milky Way is just like You know, they say the Milky Way's got 200 or 300 billion stars in it. It's amazing, huh? Just the one galaxy. Well, you can practically see them all. It's so inspiring what emerges when the sun has gone down. When the noise in our minds, that's a bad, yeah, I got to find a better way because it's, I don't like to think of it. It's just part of us. And to call it the noise is sort of like, it's already getting away from the attitude I like to hold, that we hope we all hold, which is to hold ourselves in kindness. So I realized calling it the noise, already we've taken a piece of ourselves and we're sort of like making it like this bad old noise. But I hope you get the point I was making. I'll have to find some better terms. When that can sort of settle, the sun goes down, something, it's actually not subtle. When you look up there at those stars, there is nothing subtle about it, because it's not just one sun, it's the power of hundreds of billions of suns. That's the power we're talking about. But it feels subtler because of what can feel so close in our face, this one bright sun. When that part settles out in us, something very profound and deep of our, I'll just call it our own, I'm just going to go for it. I say, I don't feel bound by this Theravada Buddhist way. Those who know me know that. Something quite beautiful and profound emerges. Something maybe that's more fundamental about the nature of our own being, really, can come filling in, and something that's more satisfying. And it's possible then to live more out of that place. I'll just end with this. My wife practices in a particular Qigong tradition, and I don't practice in Qigong, and there's lots of different teachers and different flavors of that. But I hang around it. It's around me enough where I kind of pick up on it. And with her particular teacher, they have this way of speaking of, you want to live more aligned with, they call it your true self. So that's a tricky word. It can have a lot of different meanings. But so I want to be careful. I don't really know what they're talking about, but I'm not going to call it the true self, but something more fundamental about our being can reveal itself. And so we get emptied out and we get filled up. And it can be like that. So thank you for listening, for your kind attention.